From a young age, we're handed a very specific script about adulthood. You graduate, you secure a steady income, and eventually you walk up the driveway of a place you own. It is often presented as the definitive sign that you've finally arrived. That cultural pressure is backed by a financial argument passed down through generations. You will be told that buying a home is the primary driver of wealth, while paying rent is exactly the same as setting your cash on fire. The reality is that both paths carry significant unrecoverable costs. To find the real winner, you have to look past the monthly payment and see how these two assets actually behave over a 20-year timeline. Choosing the wrong financial vehicle for your specific lifestyle and goals carries high stakes. You risk sacrificing six figures in potential compound interest, or trapping yourself in an asset that drains your savings through transaction fees if you're forced to move. To see exactly how this works, we have to start at a perfectly equal baseline. Two identical people. Both are 32 years old, both earn $80,000 a year, and through careful budgeting, both have managed to save exactly $80,000 in cash. The buyer decides to purchase a $350,000 home. Doing this immediately drains their entire liquid savings to cover a 20% down payment, plus closing costs, lender fees, and inspections. Before they've even moved in, their cash is gone. The renter takes a different route. They lease a comparable three-bedroom home in the same neighborhood for $2,000 a month. Because they didn't buy, they keep their liquid cash, and they put that entire $80,000 directly into a broad stock market index fund. Right now, their net worth is identical, but over the next 20 years, the rigid mechanics of these two choices will push their wealth in two completely different directions. This chart breaks down the buyer's $2,653 monthly cost. Early on, the vast majority goes to interest, taxes, insurance, and maintenance. Only a tiny fraction pays down principal. Compare that to the renter's $2,000 unrecoverable cost. No taxes, insurance, or broken water heater bills. In these early years, the buyer is actually paying more in purely unrecoverable costs, money they will never see again, than the renter is paying in rent. The buyer is also taking on concentration risk. They have taken their entire net worth and tied it to the value of one single physical structure, located on one specific street, relying entirely on the local economy of that city. That physical asset restricts their options. If an incredible job offer opens up in another state, or a family emergency requires a sudden relocation, they cannot simply pack up and leave without a complex financial exit. If they are forced to sell the house within the first few years, the transaction costs are steep. Agent commissions and closing fees can easily run up to 10% of the sale price, which often wipes out whatever tiny sliver of equity they manage to build. Buying a home is essentially a forced savings plan, but it's an illiquid one that punishes you if your career or life requires you to move within a 7 to 10-year window. The renter avoids those transaction traps, but their path requires them to weaponize a different financial tool: opportunity cost. The money they didn't spend on a house has alternative uses, and for the math to work, it has to go to work. To have any chance of beating the buyer, the renter must immediately deploy their $80,000 into the market. Assuming a historical 10% average annual return, that initial capital becomes a powerful compounding engine over the next 2 decades. But that initial $80,000 is only part of the equation. Because the renter pays $2,000 in rent, while the buyer pays over $2,600 for their mortgage and upkeep, the renter has an extra $600 of monthly cash flow that they must also invest. When executed correctly, this creates specific advantages. The renter maintains total geographic flexibility. Their wealth is globally diversified, containing thousands of different companies, rather than one single house. But there is no margin for error here. Renting only builds wealth if you treat that monthly savings as a strict mandatory investment, rather than disposable cash for a nicer lifestyle. The primary risk to the renter's strategy isn't the stock market dropping, it's the landlord. Rent almost never stays flat. If rent increases by an average of 3% a year, that $2,000 payment creeps higher. Within a decade, it approaches $2,700. The monthly cash flow advantage the renter started with steadily shrinks, and eventually it disappears. This is where time favors the buyer. Their principal and interest payment is locked in. While taxes and insurance will rise, the bulk of their monthly cost stays frozen for 30 years, becoming comparatively cheaper as inflation erodes the value of the dollar. We use the price-to-rent ratio, a home's purchase price divided by its annual rent. Under 15 means property prices are low relative to leasing, making homeownership the stronger play. Over 20 means the market is expensive. Keeping cash liquid and renting wins the math. The price-to-rent ratio shows you what the market dictates, but the ultimate success of either path relies entirely on how you behave over a 20-year timeline. When you keep your wealth liquid, it stays highly accessible, and accessible cash often looks suspiciously like a nicer car or a luxury vacation. The renter's victory relies on a spreadsheet that assumes robotic discipline. It assumes that through market crashes and personal boredom, you will invest the difference every single month without fail. A mortgage removes the need for that discipline. It acts as a behavioral guardrail. You don't have to decide if you feel like building equity this month. The bank enforces that decision for you. If the renter falls victim to lifestyle creep and spends their monthly savings instead of putting it into the market, the wealth-building advantage of renting vanishes. They end up with no home equity and an investment portfolio that never grew. The most mathematically perfect strategy is useless if it fundamentally misaligns with your actual financial habits. This quadrant chart maps out the actual decision you have to make. On the horizontal axis, we have your geographical certainty, how sure you are you'll stay in one place. On the vertical axis, your investment discipline. First, consider the settler. This is someone who knows exactly where they want to live for the next decade, but they struggle to manually automate their savings each month. For the settler, who has high certainty but variable discipline, buying is the correct choice. You stay put long enough to absorb the transaction costs, and the mortgage serves as a forced wealth builder that protects you against rising housing costs. Then there is the nomad. This person works in an industry that demands mobility or lives in a highly inflated housing market. But critically, they possess unshakable financial discipline. The nomad belongs in the low-certainty, high-discipline quadrant. Renting is the superior path here. You maximize your liquidity, you avoid the fees of selling property every few years, and you capture long-term stock market growth. Renting isn't throwing money away, and buying isn't an automatic ticket to wealth. Both are just ways to pay for housing. The real winner is determined entirely by matching the right asset to your specific personality and executing that strategy for 20 years.